Hi, and welcome to our webcast for February 11, 2019.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everybody. Okay, my name is Christian Debré, and this is Amy Asbrook, the director of Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet. Also joining us, this is Taylor Ayat, just here. Okay, our policy analysis and our outreach coordinator. Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet is a non-religious organization by and for people with disability and our allies. Our goal is to inform, unify, and give voice to disability rights opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and regular ending of life practices that discriminates against people with disabilities. Today's topic: the CCA report, Something About Us Without Us, Part 1, Overarching Problem.
Okay.
So Amy will help us through this subject, which is very
disappointing. Yeah. So this is long. These reports were really long. We've gone through them so far as best we can, and we had decided that we had to divide it up into 4 separate webcasts. So this week we're starting a series of 4 webcasts looking at the Council of Canadian Academies reports that were published in December. The CCA was asked to examine the possibility of extending eligibility for assisted suicide and euthanasia to mature minors, people whose suffering is only psychological, and those who make advanced requests for assisted suicide and euthanasia before they become incompetent.
And this is caused by the law.
Yeah.
Okay, and the Carter case.
Well, it's written into the Bill C-14, the possibility of making these extensions and the need to study it. So this is the study that came because of Bill C-14.
And the trouble is this report is very, very, very important.
Right. It's very important. It's going to be seen as very authoritative, and it's biased. And, you know, obviously everybody has their own biases, but the problem is that the people who are most affected by this are people with disabilities, and their voice was not really included. Today, we're focusing on some problems that apply to all 3 reports. Over the next few weeks, we'll talk about each report separately. So we'll talk about the Mature Minors report, we'll talk about the Advanced Directives report, and we'll talk about the Psychological Suffering report. The major problem that shapes the form and content of the whole report is that disability discrimination is not considered relevant to the issue of assisted suicide and euthanasia. This shows up in many different ways. It begins with the makeup of the working group that wrote the report. None of the 43 members was disability identified. Some had professional experience with disability issues. Though the submissions of disability organizations were quoted, and 2 of the 32 report reviewers are disabled people, these measures are inadequate because of how the study was carried out. The report is designed as a dialogue with a back and forth between the differing views of working group members. To be left out of the working group means to be effectively silenced in the discussion, and that's what happened.
Yeah, you just have to remember that the 2 expert group in this subject is
doctors
of
palliative
care, who was an expert in pain of any kind, and the other experts are the handicapped people.
Right.
And almost all of them was excluded of this dialogue.
Right. There were some palliative care people, not many, and you know.
That's why I said almost.
Right. The authors did not recognize that failure to consult. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. The authors did recognize that failure to consult with Indigenous people, both in adopting the medical assistance in dying law and writing the report, was a grave error. And it was bad.
Oh, yeah. And we agree with that. But
right.
You remember that.
Right. Let me continue. They admit that even the addition of an elder's circle was inadequate to make up for the essential perspective, experience, and knowledge that were lost due to the exclusion of First Nations voices. Yet, no such concern was expressed about excluding disability leaders from the process, despite the degree to which disabled people are affected by assisted suicide and euthanasia, and the depth of the disability rights community's knowledge and understanding of this issue, because we've been working on it for 35 years.
Yes.
Since the Bouvier case in 1983. So, we're not neophytes here.
No. And we are, Amy particularly, is
don't go there. Don't go there.
Is an expert.
The reports don't acknowledge that assisted suicide and euthanasia is applied only to disabled people, whether or not they also have a terminal illness. Put another way, non-disabled people are not eligible for assisted suicide and euthanasia. Thus, the reports don't take into account the excessively large impact of assisted suicide and euthanasia on disabled people. So they act like, okay, they're one of the populations affected. No, we are the population affected.
Yeah.
And not...
You must have...
It was really nice that they quoted us. That was really nice. But, it's like... You
must have a disability to be eligible to assisted suicide or euthanasia.
Right.
You must.
Yeah.
You're not eligible.
Right. The working group didn't take notice of the connection between assisted suicide and euthanasia and disability discrimination. In their view, quote, disability and vulnerability can be understood as an interplay between a person's impairment and the accommodations available in their environment, unquote, with no mention of the implicit and explicit discrimination and prejudice and barriers. So they're pretending like, oh yeah, everybody who needs accommodations gets them. No, it's not true. First of all, accommodations are needed because of the need for because barriers exist, they need to be taken down. And accommodations are needed because of people's disabilities to make it possible for them to function in the environment. But they just pretend that there's no discrimination. It's really bizarre. The working group didn't note the importance of the fact that parental requests for medical assistance in dying for their children outnumbered requests by minors themselves by 5 to 1.
5 to 1.
They didn't seem to think that that was important. But more parents are asking to kill their kids than kids are asking to die.
And why? Because the one who are suffering is not the child, this is the parent.
Well, I mean, yes, kids are in pain, but they're not asking to die as much as parents are asking to kill the kids.
Yeah.
And that's discrimination. And because they're ignoring discrimination, they ignore that fact. Nor did they acknowledge the Pandora's box of negative image and stereotypes about disability that most non-disabled people carry with them without even knowing it. When someone becomes disabled or has a disabled child, the box is opened and the negative beliefs are suddenly applied to themselves or their disabled children. Without support, understanding, and an alternative view of disability, newly disabled people and disabled children will develop low self-esteem and a belief that they deserve to die.
Whose suffering is supposed to be relieved when parents submit requests on their kids' behalf? It's not for the kids.
Right, exactly. Although they claim it is. And, that's just another one of the things that this is a whole mind-bending thing and what the denial of discrimination means. Okay, so the idea that it is better to be dead than disabled, or that death is in the best interest of disabled people, which is a, big piece, is also woven throughout all three documents. Thus, a failure rate or noncompliance that is considered acceptable in the assisted suicide and euthanasia program would never be tolerated in a service for the non-disabled public, like consumer products or airline safety. So, for example, Quebec's Commission on End-of-Life Care boasts of a 90% compliance.
Yes, 90%. Okay, you take a ticket for a plane, and they say, we assure you that 95% of the time you will reach your destination.
Right. You might end up in Barcelona, but
oops.
Yeah.
Okay. And even sometime you could be killed. Okay.
Right.
Will you take the plane?
But you freely bought that plane ticket.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they boast of a 90% compliance rate with eligibility criteria and safeguards. From 2011 to 2018, Dutch physicians complied with due care requirements in 12 of 16 cases where the person's decision-making capacity was questioned. That's only 75%.
And just remember that Belgium and Netherlands law are very close, that our law and the society in those countries are the same as here, exactly.
Right. So, we're talking about, we need to determine that the person has capacity to make the decision, but they're not following the requirements in a quarter of the cases. Okay. Dutch end-of-life clinics were also involved in 19% of cases where due care criteria were not met, even though they handled less than 5% of all euthanasia cases. So, this whole thing of, well, my doctor won't do it for me, so I'll go to one of those instant clinics. That's what happens, is they don't do a good job of complying with the rules, and the rules are there for a reason. People with disabilities are not seen as a group whose civil rights are jeopardized by assisted suicide and euthanasia laws and practice. The Carter decision voiced this point of view, but it remains controversial, i.e., lots of disabled people disagree. We think that people's civil rights are jeopardized by assisted suicide and euthanasia. For example, the authors discuss the, quote, disability paradox, which is a fancy term for the fact that actually having a disability is not as bad as people think it will be. The authors never mention that this paradox is based on a discriminatory assumption that life with a disability is a fate worse than death. They just they talk about the disability paradox, but they don't look just underneath the surface. And that's a complaint that, sort of is fundamental to this whole problem. While advocates on both sides submitted personal stories, such accounts were treated differently depending on their source. Descriptions of disability discrimination were either ignored, such as the story of Jerica Bolin, or discussed as isolated incidents. And here's a quote. While these cases highlighted problems experienced by individuals, no conclusions can be drawn from them about support services in Canada as a whole. Yeah, maybe, but there's a lot of research behind that. And if they had even bothered to look at the research on community-based care and that, they would find that, in fact, that is something that is necessary and they could draw conclusions, but oh well. It's just individual disabled people complaining, I guess.
Just push it up.
I love how I love how in the papers they mention Roger Foley.
Yeah.
They mention Candace Lewis, not by name.
Right.
And they do not mention Tyson and Amy, the advocates from out east.
Right, exactly.
but they doesn't take notice of it. They just
right from Manitoba, you mean?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and it really sounds like they were making an effort to make disabled people feel included. And so our criticism is going to sound really like sour grapes. Well, we weren't included enough. Well, yeah, kind of. What we're saying.
We are the main subject, and they just toss it apart.
Right. On the other hand, stories provided by assisted suicide and euthanasia advocacy groups were seen as fighting unjust deprivation of legal rights. And here's the quote. Many of the personal stories shared by Dying with Dignity Canada in its submissions to the call for input expressed the unfairness of losing the option to receive MAID. And they talk about that in terms of a right. And it's not really a right, it's a suspension of the homicide law. Okay. The absence of disability rights voice among the working group members is especially noticeable in the report's discussion of autonomy. So in one section, they talk about, here's 2 views of autonomy. The working group debated whether autonomy means that society should provide everyone with a level playing field, or should it mean that everyone is free, quote unquote, to play on the field whether or not it's accessible. And these concepts of equality, equity, and justice are related, but they're not the same. This is often shown by a graphic of 3 children of different heights or sizes watching a ball game from behind a wooden fence. Equality means providing the same supports and resources regardless of the person's needs or without reference to the outcome. So each child gets 1 box to stand on. So the tall kid is way above the fence. The middle-sized kid can see now over the fence, but the small kid can't see over the fence. Equity requires providing supports that take individual needs into account. In the picture, the smallest child stands on 2 boxes he can see over. The medium-sized child gets 1 box and he can see over, and the tallest kid stands on the ground and all 3 can watch the game. But real justice involves removing the barrier altogether. The wooden structure is replaced by a chain link fence that clears the view for everyone. Imagine that. Okay, where the authors talk about safeguards, so cat video, incoming cat.
Sorry.
Where the authors talk about safeguards, it was always in a perfect world scenario, whereas safeguards are supposed to be effective even in real life worst case scenarios. So the discussion of capacity determinations is missing several important elements because of that. For example, in the Mature Minors paper, the authors described the capacity determination process without reference to the high rates of abuse of disabled children, or the broad popular support for parents who kill their disabled children and claim a mercy killing defense. Think of Latimer. So, I mean, how can you talk about kids making decisions and family influence without thinking of those things?
Yeah.
They acted as though the only problem that ever happened is parents trying to do whatever possible to save the kid's life, as if Robert Latimer never existed. Also, capacity determination is described as a detailed process using assessment tools to establish specific abilities, whereas studies have shown that, in fact, doctors rarely use the assessment tools, they don't use them correctly, and they don't assess all the abilities that add up to capacity.
And the law doesn't have any teeth.
Right. Yeah.
So they could do whatever they want.
Right. So, and here are a few examples of that. We already know that doctors face no consequences for submitting documentation that is incomplete or contains errors, or for filing reports late or not at all. We talked about that. There's a citation in the report that goes back to our December study and also to the regulations.
And we know that it will happen, and it's right now happening. We predict it because in Belgium it's already happening before the law that we put in front. So,
right. Also,
we just don't believe what happened in Belgium will happen in Canada. We are a lot better than Belgian people.
Right. Also, euthanasia is supposed to be the last resort after palliative care fails, but in practice, it's often the first option presented to a person in distress. We talked about that last month. The report didn't recognize factors that influenced whether consent is truly informed, like the reports did not address the need to ensure that a person with disabilities has an effective and impartial means of communication, especially not being spoken for by a family member who has a financial interest in the person's estate. That would be important. And what's more, if the doctor doesn't know about self-directed personal assistance services, or if palliative care is not available in a particular community, the person in distress will not have a real choice with respect to assisted suicide and euthanasia.
All I can think of are doctors who are so insulated from the lives of people in poverty, or really anyone in any kind of need, they'd be at a complete loss. And assisted suicide promoters are so keen on making sure they have access to that one procedure in a rural area. But what about other options that even people in big cities struggle to get to?
Right. I mean, we're in a medium-sized town, and right now our local hospital has a 256% occupancy rate at this emergency room.
And it's not just a partial incident. It's happening a lot of time in a year.
Right, exactly. Problems such as substance abuse, homelessness, poverty, and domestic violence are linked more to the individual than to their social, economic, political, or discrimination-based causes. It's not that the report doesn't say that there are social causes, but it's that they put it on the person. And so the solutions are therefore left up to the person rather than the society that created the underlying problem.
And it should be the society.
Right, exactly. In a similar vein, socio-political issues related to disability are stripped of their political importance. And we're not talking partisan here. We're not talking about whether something's liberal or conservative. We're talking about the political impact of something. So caregiving is described as burdensome and exhausting. And there is even some admission that the burden of caregiving falls excessively on women. However, the authors don't connect the dots between negative attitudes toward disabled people, the belief that caregiving is women's work, the devaluation of caregiving and the low pay as an occupation, and the expectation that family members, especially women, must take on these responsibilities without compensation. So this is where disability and sexism, the discrimination intersects. Yeah. And they just don't deal with that as a political issue. And it is a political issue.
It's obvious.
Societal issue. In their discussion of autonomy, the council ignores the impact of disability discrimination and the medical model as factors in the power imbalance between a parent and a child, or a doctor and a patient. So if a doctor has the same impression about the quality of life of disability, a person with a disability being lower than a non-disabled person, that's going to have an impact in the kind of diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, everything that the doctor does with the person, not just the counseling about end of life. And the same with the parents and the child. If the parents view disability as a bad thing, and child is born with a disability or has a disability, the child doesn't see the disability as separate from them. The parent says, oh, this is such a terrible, tragic thing. The child says, oh, I'm terrible and tragic. They don't see the difference. Also, mental disorders are disconnected from causes related to discrimination, such as isolation, inadequate health care, abuse, and bullying. So, basically they only talk about mental disorders as if they were separate from everything else. But disabled people are more susceptible because they experience discrimination. For example, the experience of many disabled children is comparable to that of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex children growing up in a society that sees a fundamental part of them as other or bad. The fact that many people with physical or sensory or cognitive disabilities often end up with mental health issues due to the effects of discrimination is not seen as a political issue. In fact, it's barely recognized, really. As so often happens. Yeah. Go ahead. Did you want to add something?
I saw this study. I need to look at the study to see how they picked their population, basically. Mm-hmm. But it was something like 28% of adults with the same disability as me end up having anxiety and depression.
It's not CP, it's discrimination. Get it? As often happens, the working group distinguishes between committing suicide with and without medical assistance and assigns positive and negative values to those things. So ending one's life without the help of a medical professional is portrayed as dangerous, selfish, and tragic, while doing so with society's permission and the help of a professional is portrayed as safe, humane, and peaceful.
Which is not true.
They just can't help themselves. They fall into this idea.
A suicide is a suicide, whether somebody helped you or not.
They would like to be objective, but they can't help themselves. And that's, okay, but they need to admit that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
Suicide prevention is
they're acting like just because.
Go ahead.
Oh.
Just because.
Sorry, I thought I heard something beeping. They're acting like just because you introduce a needle, you're going to automatically have your loved ones around. Yeah. No one will be arguing.
Family fight.
It'll be just like a movie, and you can slip away peacefully.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that.
Suicide prevention is only discussed in the context of mental disorders as the sole reason for assisted suicide and euthanasia requests, not as something that happens because people are beaten down by discrimination. So this reflects the ongoing effort by MAID promoters to exclude assisted suicide and euthanasia from the definition of suicide. And we've talked about that in the past. They're trying to say, oh, it's not really suicide if you're disabled or dying or whatever. It's suicide.
They try to just separate it by many means and by using euphemism in different words and so on and so on. But a suicide, still a suicide.
Right.
It's clear.
In the mature minor paper, little attention is paid to teenage suicidality. They talk about it, but they don't deal with it in the context of people with disabilities who are, feeling pressure because of their parents' view of their disability, etc. And there is no indication that problems with self-esteem and suicidal feelings caused by disability discrimination need to be attended to.
I feel like it wouldn't even register for most people. Instead, they'd say, why bother? If your condition can't change, why should these dark clouds hanging over you go away? Because your condition is the real problem.
Right, exactly. People blame the condition instead of the way society looks at disabled people. And there's an old saying, shit flows downhill. And that means that the person who's vulnerable, the least powerful, the vulnerable person is always blamed for their problems rather than the society that causes them. Yeah. All right. So these omissions and errors cast doubt on the value of the CCA reports as a thorough investigation of the questions presented. However, given the investment of time and resources in producing the report, it will be touted as the final authority in research on the topic, and it will be cited in court cases, legislative records, and academic works around the world for many years to come. The tragedy here is that, once again, the disability rights perspective has been excluded when so many disabled lives are on the line. And when I studied journalism, you know, our professors were smart enough to disabuse people of the idea that there is such a thing as an objective perspective. And I got that. That made sense to me. And in fact, that's why I didn't want to pursue journalism, because everybody tried to pretend they were being objective, but, you know, in fact, they really weren't, and they wouldn't admit it. So that's the situation, I think, with these academics. They would like to believe that this is an objective work, but it's not. And it would be at least a little more honest if they admitted it, but they didn't, and they don't. And disabled people got shut out again. So one more time, it's something about us without us, and oh well.
It's the same as those doctors. They don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, they don't know what they don't know.
You should give us the
coordinates for this.
Yes.
Okay, so if you want more information about the topics that we discuss here, you can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/toujours vivant, not dead yet. You can visit our website at tvndy.ca. You can email us at info@tv-ndy.ca, or you can follow us on Twitter @TVNDY. Thanks to Taylor for helping out, and thanks to Christian as well.
Thank you, Amy.
And we will see you next time. Have a good week.
See you soon.
Bye.